Oh, hello. I'm here today to do a little tour of a cool neighborhood in the north of Manhattan known as Washington Heights. This is going to be a good one, guys. I'm going to lower my mask because I'm not around a lot of people, so it makes it easier to understand, so relax. Behind me is the George Washington Bridge. I'll be talking about that in a little bit. Before we start, just go ahead and like it. You're going to like this tour anyway. Go ahead and like it on YouTube. Subscribe, please. It really helps. And also, please check out my Patreon. All that stuff. Just want to throw that all ahead of you. We're going to be walking down Broadway. This is going to be one that was picked by my patrons, Patreon people, you know. But this is going to be a good one. Phil, you ready to do this?
Yeah, let's do it.
It's going to be a fun one. I like this neighborhood a lot, so I don't know. Let's go. So we are in Washington Heights, man. I love this neighborhood. The Heights is a really, really cool place. This is a very Dominican neighborhood. This is where all the all mi gente de la República Dominicana is where they all live. It's like the center of the Dominican Republic diaspora in the United States. But this neighborhood's changed a lot and has been changing a lot, but it's still, despite the fact that it's in Manhattan, has retained a lot of its Dominican and Latino flavor, which is pretty awesome. To give you a little bit of the history, this neighborhood didn't start developing itself until fairly recently. In fact, the subway is pretty much the reason why this neighborhood and area started to get developed. Before that, it was pretty much farmland. The grid of Manhattan, which I've talked about in so many videos, ended at 155th Street, which is the southern border of Washington Heights. So they didn't even really plan to, you know, develop this anyway. So it wasn't until the subway was opened in 1904 that started to populate this area. Before that, this was all big properties, pretty much. Some very famous people had properties up here. We'll talk about some of them on this tour later on. But early on, this was actually an Irish neighborhood in the early 1900s. Then it became a Jewish neighborhood. Later on, in like the 70s, 80s, it became actually Puerto Rican, some Cuban. And it wasn't until really actually recently, in like the 80s and 90s, that it became Dominican. Oh, geez, Phil, you okay?
Yeah. 1 second.
So some of the immigrant groups as well that passed through here, the Jews who came escaping Nazism in Germany. In fact, they called this Frankfurt on the Hudson in the 1930s because there were so many Jewish people here in this area, Washington Heights. It actually didn't get the name Washington Heights till fairly recently either. This was always considered kind of an extension of Fort Tryon, which is right to the north of us. We'll talk about some of that history here as well. Here to the left is a pretty cool theater. This is actually a theater designed by Thomas Lamb, a very famous theater architect here in New York City. But this was designed as a movie house in the 1930s, and then in the 1960s, late 1960s, in 1969, when movie houses had started to decline, this was bought out by a church, an evangelical church, and is still, you can see some of the pictures of what it looks like inside. They rent it out sometimes to like music groups and stuff. I actually came here once on a date. Came here to see Bob Dylan on a date. That's a pretty good date. But yeah, it was pretty cool. In case you don't know, I like Bob Dylan. He's great. In case you're wondering what happened to that date, she is now married to a famous producer in Hollywood. Go figure. So here to the right, you have a very famous restaurant here called Malecón. Malecón is a very famous Dominican Caribbean restaurant here. It's super, super good. They call it El Rey del Pollo because it's like the king of the chicken. King of chicken, like they're good at making chicken. Not like the king of the chickens, you know, like, but it's really, really good. Man, rice and beans, all that kind of stuff. I love that. That's my favorite type of food. Reminds me of home. That's what I grew up eating. Porque soy nicaragüense, jodido. Really cool. You hear a lot of Dominican Spanish here. They're very different. You hear like the, oye papi, ¿cómo te va todo? Mira esta vaina. They talk like a very different type of Spanish. It's kind of cool. So we're walking south on Broadway. They also call this Juan Rodriguez Way. Juan Rodriguez. And the reason they call it that is because they're commemorating what was the first, they say, the first Hispanic Latino who had ever settled in New York City. Back then it was New Amsterdam. It wasn't even New Amsterdam yet. So this guy named Jan Rodriguez, spelled Rodriguez like the Portuguese, was born to a Portuguese sailor and a black woman in the Dominican Republic. Then he came here and he stayed put. He came here on a trading mission with the Dutch, and then he just stayed with the natives. And he stayed here and he just learned the Lenape language and just hung out, and was the first permanent non-native settler in New York City history. He's kind of like the original Dances with Wolves. You guys know what that movie is? Movie with Kevin Costner. You know the movie Dances with Wolves, Phil? You do? In case you guys don't know, you're too young, maybe they'll remake it with Channing Tatum or something, or Kevin Hart, most likely. Surprised you know that one, Phil. You usually don't know those older movies. Thanks. I appreciate that. But yeah, so a little bit of history too. This neighborhood I was saying didn't really get developed until the early 1900s, more developed. But before that, like I said, it was big estates. People like John James Audubon. You guys ever heard of the Audubon Society? Very famous with birds and bird species. I'll talk about him a little later. He had his estate up here. But even before that, some of the famous history that it had was history dealing with the American Revolution. Now, in past videos, in fact, in the Brooklyn Heights video, sick plug, I talked about the Battle of Long Island, which happened in August 1776, and it's when the British basically booted the Americans, the Continental Army, out of New York. But when they booted the Americans off of, basically back then, Long Island, out of Brooklyn, Washington came onto Manhattan, and then he slowly started leaving the island of Manhattan. And on his way out, he passed through here. They had a battle of Harlem Heights just to the south of us, and then his last stand before he left Manhattan Island was made here in Washington Heights. In fact, the highest point in Manhattan today is in a place called Bennett Park, and that is where the fort was located, and he made his last stand. I'll take you there right now. So I'm standing here at Bennett Park at 181st Street at the highest point in Manhattan right here, 265 feet above sea level. Holy crap. But this park is actually built here on land that used to be owned by James Gordon Bennett, who was the owner of the New York Herald newspaper. Oh, that's where Herald Square got its name, where Macy's is. What? And that's also where Times Square got its idea to be named after New York Times. Whoa, so cool, Tom. But also more interesting is this is where Fort Washington used to be located, the highest point where George Washington was trying to defend the island, his last stand against the British and Hessian troops as they drove them all out of New York at the beginning of the Revolutionary War in the fall of 1776. Pretty cool history here around all these little houses. Very starting to become a fancier little neighborhood, little small young families and things like that. But pretty sick. Now back to the tour. And look at that, we're right back. Isn't that great? So that is where he made his last stand. He actually watched as the actual British came in and killed his men. He watched from the New Jersey side, but then the British took over Manhattan, and this became their headquarters for the rest of the American Revolution until 1783, when Washington came back in and retook it. Oh, look at that. Now, I was saying too that this area too is very Dominican. The Dominicans have kind of set up shop here today, but the Dominicans originally started coming in huge waves not until like the 70s and 80s and 90s, and one of the reasons was because there was a dictatorship from the early 1930s all the way until 1961. His name was Rafael Trujillo. He was a dictator, an awful, awful guy. He slaughtered Haitians, extremely repressive. He murdered his rivals, and the US backed him, believe it or not. I'm sure you believe it. And in 1961, when he finally stopped serving use to the Americans, they finally said, all right, you guys can get rid of him. And he was assassinated with the help of the CIA. Then it was complete tumult for a few years, civil war, all that stuff, until the year 1965, when there was a military kind of takeover. The United States helped. Lyndon Johnson brought in the military to straighten things out, but travel restrictions were eased and the Dominicans were able to travel more. And it just so happened that there was already some Latinos in this area when they did start coming in more and more numbers in the 70s, 80s, and they just kind of took over here. So to give you an idea, of all the Dominicans in the United States, more than half are located in New York. That's saying a lot. And this is the center of all of it. So to give you an idea, in New York City even, there's like almost 650,000 Dominicans. That's a lot. Compare that to the 45 in the entire state of Wyoming. It's kind of ridiculous. The Dominican Republic is obviously a country in the Caribbean on the island of Hispaniola. It was actually where Christopher Columbus, he actually landed there in 1492. Believe it or not, his brother Bartholomew Columbus, helped to found the city of Santo Domingo. Can you imagine being Bartholomew Columbus? Imagine living in the shadow of that brother. He's like, hey, I helped found the city of Santo Domingo. And his brother's like, yeah, whatever, dude. Come back to me when you discover half of the entire globe. But then he's like, yeah, but you slaughtered more natives than I did. And then Christopher Columbus is like, touche, good brother, touche. So So the actual boundaries of Washington Heights are pretty much from 155th up to like 185th. In fact, one of the reasons why this neighborhood is very popular and active also is because of the George Washington Bridge, which connects New Jersey. It's the only bridge from New Jersey into Manhattan. The rest are tunnels. Why don't we go there now? Oh, hello. I'm just here at the base of the George Washington Bridge, which is this bridge that connects Manhattan to New Jersey, Fort Lee, New Jersey. This was finished in 1931. Otmar Ammann was the engineer. He actually ended up designing the Verrazano-Narrows Bridge in the Staten Island, the Triborough Bridge. But in 1931, it became the longest suspension bridge in the world and was eventually surpassed in 1937 by the Golden Gate Bridge. This is actually the busiest bridge in New York City. It sees 108 million vehicles every year. It's double-decker. Pretty cool. You may recognize it from Die Hard with a Vengeance. Also, too, the first people to cross the bridge in 1931 when it opened, in fact, FDR, the governor of New York at the time, helped open it, were two Bronx teens on roller skates. I imagine that the second two people to cross were the Bronx teens who were chasing them and making fun of them for wearing roller skates. This behind me is actually the Little Red Lighthouse. Pretty cool little lighthouse. This was built here in 1921. It was originally in Sandy Hook, but it was dismantled in 1917, and it was rebuilt here. But then it was decommissioned in 1948. And they were actually going to tear it down, but in 1942, a famous book was written about it called The Little Red Lighthouse and the Great Gray Bridge by Hildegard Swift. So people rallied to save it. Just so you guys know, the book is actually about this little red lighthouse that's opened here by itself, but then eventually a big Great Gray Bridge is built over it with more powerful light and more attention, so it becomes sad. And then one day the fog makes it necessary again. And it realizes, hey, it doesn't matter how small I am or how small my light is, I am needed too. So that's the moral of the story. No matter how small you are, your light is needed by someone. You hear that, Mom? It doesn't matter that all the other lighthouses that graduated law school with me are making six figures. My light is just fine, okay? Back to the tour. We're getting pretty good. I'm getting pretty good at these special effects and cutting. This is a very high production value. I hope you guys are appreciating that. So here to the left you have Columbia University, not the actual school, but they have the medical school and hospitals here. Columbia University we'll do in a different video. Actually barely lost out to this one. Morningside Heights is the neighborhood it's in. But Columbia University used to be King's College. It was named that after the British when it was still New York. And then they changed the name when the British were booted. They changed it to Columbia because they didn't want the stain of the British name on their stuff. But famous for being the actual alma mater of Alexander Hamilton, who, by the way, had a play written about him, a musical, by Lin-Manuel Miranda, who wrote In the Heights about this neighborhood. He was from this neighborhood. Pretty cool, huh? See how I wrapped it all around there? It's a small world, huh? I'll give this guy some money. You gotta support the artists in the streets, man. One of my pet peeves is when people take pictures or film musicians or artists and don't give them money. All right, so another thing too is there are a lot of famous Dominicans that have come out of, the Dominican Republic. Some include A-Rod, Alex Rodriguez, the other half of J-Lo. And also too, Pedro Martinez. You guys know the pitcher for the Boston Red Sox. He was famous for actually throwing Don Zimmer down on the ground during a fight in a baseball game. Kind of messed up. Don Zimmer was like 75 years old. All right, anyways, this to the left is cool. This is a super cool piece of history right here. Long story short, February 21st, 1965, this is where Malcolm X was assassinated. How about that for a fact? So Malcolm X was a man named Malcolm Little. He actually went to prison at 20 years old for 6 years for theft, all this stuff. Came out converted. He had taught himself to read by reading the dictionary and over again. He came here to head up a mosque of the Nation of Islam. He became an icon. He basically helped push forward the civil rights movement. He was kind of the more militant arm of the movement, whereas Martin Luther King Jr. was the more peaceful. At least that's how people considered them. but very important. He helped rally people. He helped give people a sense of strength and purpose. The different African Americans who were looking for leaders at the time. He actually made a trip to Mecca. He made his pilgrimage, and he came back kind of a changed man. And he decided he wanted to be more inclusive and more open to other cultures and do this together, that kind of thing. But by that point, he'd already burned too many bridges with the Nation of Islam, and they had him assassinated. Someone in the audience at a speech that he was giving here yelled, "Get your hand out of my pocket." There was a big commotion. People ran up, shot him 21 times on stage. He was taken to the hospital right here, and he died. Pretty messed up. They had actually burned his house down 1 week prior. He had been a marked man for like a year before that. So he was a long time coming. So it all happened right here, the Audubon Ballroom, pretty cool. And then Columbia actually bought this building, and they were gonna tear it down. And people got all pissed off, and they're like, no, you're not gonna do that. There was a big push, a big fight, and they eventually saved it. Saved at least half of it as a compromise. But it's better than nothing. But the moral of that story is you gotta fight for stuff you believe in, right? If you ever wanna read, I think, one of the best books of all time is the autobiography of Malcolm X, which was written in part, I guess you can't write an autobiography if you don't write part of it at least, but who helped write it was Alex Haley, who ended up writing Roots, the book series, or the book that became a TV series. One of the best books of all time. Really, really cool. Very inspirational story. How, it talks about how, maybe we're not all perfect, but what he did fight for, what he did dedicate his life to was change and positive change. Even though he may have done it in, flawed ways. Another thing you may be noticing here too is that there's lots of bodegas, or bodegas, if you want the fancy accent. But a bodega is pretty much a convenience store. Now, the word bodega means like cellar, and it's where you can go and get anything you need. Toothbrush, toothpaste, soda, whatever you need to get. But it's also kind of like a pillar of the community. It's like a mainstay. Like almost every block has one or has had one. And you can leave keys there for people. You can have packages delivered there. You just, people that trust you, they know you. The people who run them are always there. Their family's there. Very different from the 7-Elevens and stuff that are being opened now. Also, too, they're famous for their cats. There's even like bodega cats of Instagrams, like this Instagram account's kind of funny. But the cats just gonna live there. And they hang out and they help keep the place mice-free. You also hear lots of music outside on the streets, people dancing, hanging out. This is great. You're gonna see it right up here. People selling stuff in the streets. And this is Manhattan. You can't really get that vibe. That's great, dude. This is a neighborhood that is in Manhattan still, but it still has kept some of its flavor. One of the reasons is that it's kind of far out. It's way to the north at the end of the island. This and then Inwood is the last neighborhood here at the north end of the island. But it has struggled during the 80s and 90s. This was one of the centers of the crack epidemic. In fact, the Crack is Whack mural isn't too far from here, but it's in Harlem to the south. But it became a huge problem here. There were a police officer was actually murdered here, a 24-year-old police officer. Put this on while I'm walking through. There was an apartment building where one man tried to organize the tenants of the apartment to push out some of a gang called the Jerry Curls. That was the name of one of the crack gangs. And he was killed. So different things like that happen. What ends up happening is these neighborhoods hit rock bottom in a way. And the only way you can go up is up. The only way you can go then is up. So different investors and developers will come in because things are so cheap, and they'll try to build it up using the help of the city to, clean it up or whatever, invest money in it. The problem ends up being that a lot of times the policies that the city enacts don't include everybody, or they're racist, or they're classist. There's big problems with that. And, they only benefit a certain amount of people. You okay there, Phil? Phil, you got a trip there. I'm worried about you. I'm worried sick. So we're walking south here on Broadway, by the way, which is the longest street in New York. Broadway starts down at Battery Park, and it goes all the way up through Manhattan into the Bronx, crossing the Harlem River. Then it leaves the Bronx, continues all the way to Albany, another 100 and so miles. And yeah, I know I've talked about that in other videos. I've gotten people say, hey, you repeat yourself sometimes, repeat some facts. Well, first of all, chill out, all right? This is all free. People love to criticize. I give you guys all this for free. And two, second of all, those are important facts. This is the kind of stuff that every New Yorker should know. And if I repeat them, it's because you need to know it. So things like the grid of 1811, you got to know that. Things like consolidation of 1898, you got to know that. Things like Broadway being the longest street, you got to know that. Come on. So remember it. And if you want to criticize my stuff, I'll put a website at the bottom. You can just send all your complaints there. You see all the people selling all these stuff on the street. It's pretty cool. You can get all this kind of stuff for pretty cheap. So I was talking to you guys earlier about Lin-Manuel Miranda, who's Puerto Rican. In fact, I actually mentioned him in my last video that I did, well, a video that I did about Puerto Rico. You should check it out. I did a tour of San Juan, Puerto Rico. Sick plug, baby. But I also wanted to include that. Hey, how are you? Hi, how are you? That was very nice. So I wanted, Lin-Manuel Miranda was from here, but he was Puerto Rican. Look at this, you got doing like a little.
Con un mes prepagado, ¿ok? Y el próximo teléfono se va en 40 minutos. Así que si no tienes un ticket, consíguelo en este momento. Acércate con tus amigos aquí de Bus Mobile. Consigue un teléfono exactamente en 40 minutos.
Oh, I got it. You want this? Go, take it, sure. Hey, how you doing? It's totally wild, man. I just got like a little flyer. I think it was for a discount on something. And there were people right next to that place where they're giving out the discounts collecting the flyers. So they can get all the discounts. Yeah, well, you know, glad I could help in some way. I love it, man. That's what the cool thing about this neighborhood, that even now, during COVID, I mean, people out here, they're doing their thing. There's still a ton of street life here normally. People are out in the streets, they're listening to music. You could hear the radio station had their promotions going on there. It's great. You can see all these Christmas trees. I'll put this on since we're walking through. So we're walking now, continuing south. You see here to the right, Boricua College. I talked about the Boricua, the word Boricua in that same Puerto Rico video. It comes from Borinquen, which is the word that the Taino Indians used to have for the island of Puerto Rico, which is where they were living when the Spanish came in the early 1500s. But this is a little college here. And then also here, this is really cool. It's closed, unfortunately, but this is the Hispanic Society of America. It's a museum. It's built in 1904 right here to the left. They have works by El Greco, Velázquez. They have tons and tons of really cool stuff. Goya, they have all kinds of paintings and things as well. There's a statue over there. You see the statue? That's El Cid. He was a Spanish soldier who was given the name El Cid by the Moors of Spain. Pretty cool, huh? Look at that. Look at all this Hispanic and Latino flavor here. I love it. Here to the left, you have the Church of the Intercession, which was built in 1913 by Bertram Goodhue, very famous church designer. He designed St. Thomas on Fifth Avenue. And then over here to the right, it's a very cool style too, no? Not a really cool style of church. A little neo-Gothic there, little arches and all that stuff. And then to the left, if we go down this way, you get to the Morris Jumel Mansion, which is right near us, just a few blocks that way. Let's go over there and check it out. So this is now the Morris Jumel Mansion. It's pretty cool. This is actually the oldest house in Manhattan. This was actually built in 1765 for a man named Roger Morris, who owned all this land. He was a British dude, and when the British and the Revolution started, he boots, he leaves, he goes over to back to England, and this actually gets confiscated after war. But during the war, this actually served as the headquarters for Washington as he was evacuating New York at the beginning. This was used as his headquarters. He slept here, he worked here, and also in the early 1800s, Napoleon is said to have slept here. But after the war, a man named Steve Jumel takes over, and he's married to a woman named Eliza Jumel, who is a former prostitute. Oh boy, I'm not judging. You know, they're married for a little bit, and he ends up dying in a carriage accident, and then later in her life, at 58 years old, she marries 77-year-old Aaron Burr, who they say was chasing the dough. Aaron Burr, by the way, is the guy who assassinated, well, he didn't assassinate him, he killed him in a duel, Alexander Hamilton. What? We've talked about Alexander Hamilton a lot on this tour. And in fact, Lin-Manuel Miranda, who wrote Hamilton, wrote part of it in this museum. What? Isn't that crazy? Today, this building is actually an apartment where 200 people live, spending $3,500 a month in rent each. I'm kidding. It's actually a museum. I said that before. Oh, and also over here to the left, you have Sylvan Terrace. These row houses were actually built from 1890 to 1902 on land that was partitioned off of this Jumel land plot, which is pretty cool. It used to be hundreds of acres. Pretty crazy. I remember how I told you that this was all plots of land. Well, that's what they were breaking up. Okay, well, that's enough, guys. I think I can get back to the tour on Broadway. Let's go. Now let's walk this way. So that was pretty cool, huh? Now we're walking along this cool spot. This is the Trinity Cemetery. We're at 155th. This is pretty much the southern end of Washington Heights. This is the only active cemetery in Manhattan. So what happened was, by the early 1800s, the Trinity Cemetery around Trinity Church, which I've talked about in my video for Lower Manhattan, sick plug, baby, got filled up. So they bought all this land here around that time, and they started a new cemetery. Now, some of the people that are buried in this cemetery include Ed Koch, former mayor of New York. I talked about him in the Roosevelt Island video because, sick plug, look at that, we're racking him up. But I talked about him because he was the mayor of New York starting in 1978 during some of the tougher times of the city. Jewish mayor. Also, too, you had John James Audubon is buried here. He was the guy who started the Audubon Society. And that guy, he painted hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of species of birds. Really a fan and a protector of birds and different bird species. You also have Clement Clarke Moore is buried here. He was the guy who wrote "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." He was the son of Benjamin Moore, who was the Chelsea landowner who actually basically started Chelsea as we know it today. Very nice little neighborhood. He was the landowner. It was all developed by Clement Clarke Moore and that family to make it a nice little spot for people to live, you know. Some other famous people who are buried here: John Jacob Astor. I've talked about him a ton, but he was one of the famous men, most rich men, one of the richest men to ever live. Okay, look, I'm doing this all off the cuff, okay, so relax, I slip up sometimes. But one of the richest men to ever live. He was a real estate guy, owned tons and tons of land all over New York, but he's buried here. Oh, also Dr. David Hosack, who was the doctor who tended to Alexander Hamilton when he died in the duel. He also tended to Philip Hamilton, who was Alexander Hamilton's son, who died in a duel 2 years before. And Alexander Hamilton still took that duel. What an idiot. So, another person too, Henry Brevoort. Henry Brevoort was a landowner in the East Village who gave up his land to build Grace Church by James Renwick Jr., who designed St. Patrick's Cathedral, who also landscaped some of this cemetery. Come on, look at all these small world, huh? Ah, crap, it's closed. Well, you can't always get what you want. Look at the kitty. Whee. Oh, that stinks. Oh, Phil, you all right, dude? Hey, kitty. Ah, dang it. Well, we're here at the entrance of the Trinity Church Cemetery, and we can't go in, unfortunately, which stinks. But we just covered Washington Heights. Pretty quick walk there, no, Phil?
Yeah.
You almost fell a couple of times, but that's okay.
Twice.
Yeah, that's you're safe. That's what's important. But it's a cool neighborhood. I told you this neighborhood started as land from a tribe of the Lenape Indians. It was finally privatized in 1712 and then parceled out to rich landowners from Harlem to the south. And it wasn't really developed until after the subway opened in 1904. So it's gone through some changes, and today it's still retains some of its flavor, some of its Latino and diversity, which is really awesome. But that's something you got to protect. You got to fight for that, because things, at least before COVID, were really moving quickly in the opposite direction, where things are built up for the very wealthy, for the very undiverse, to put it mildly. That's something you got to fight for, and something worth protecting. Protection is an active verb. Remember that. But anyways, that being said, I gotta end the tour here. Before I do that, please subscribe. Please like the video, and also, more importantly, please check out my Patreon. I'd really love any support you could give me. Really trying to make this thing big. We're gonna go all around the world, baby. Come on, and then we'll see where it goes. So any Patreon help would be great. That being said, I guess I could end the tour here. pretty soon, I don't know. Anything, did I miss anything, Phil?
No, I think you covered it all.
What'd you think, man? Was that a pretty good tour?
It was a great tour.
Hey, thanks, man. You're a good guy. You guys should check out Phil's channel. I always get on him for posting more. He's got to post more stuff. But anyways, that being said, guys, that's the tour. See y'all later. Sick.